It all started on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. At least, that's how I thought it would be. But when you have a neighbor like Karen, ordinary quickly turns into something straight out of a drama series. I had just finished setting up the centerpiece of my dream, an outdoor barbecue setup. This wasn't just any grill. It was a stone-built, professional-level grill with a smoker, a sleek wooden deck, and custom seating arrangements. It wasn't just a place to cook. It was a place where neighbors could come together, share stories, and bond over delicious food. After months of planning, I was finally ready for the feast I'd promised. And then came Karen. Now, Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the HOA president, and she took her role a little too seriously. You know the type, the one who insists the color of your mailbox needs to match the one in her approved list, or that your garden needs to be trimmed just so. She'd already made life miserable for many of us with her petty complaints, but today was going to be different. I was just about to light the grill when I saw her, the all-too-familiar figure, marching across the street in her ridiculous designer workout gear, strutting like she owned the entire block. I knew what was coming. "Mark," she called out, her voice dripping with that overly sweet tone that made me want to scream. "We need to talk." I turned to face her, trying to remain calm, but I could already feel my blood pressure rising. "What's the problem this time, Karen?" I asked, my voice tight with irritation. "Well, I've received several complaints," Karen began, her hands on her hips in that condescending way she had perfected. "About your barbecue setup." I blinked, trying to process what I was hearing. "Complaints? From who?" "I'm just having a neighborhood gathering." "Oh, it's not just a gathering," she said, her smile widening in that fake way she did when she thought she was winning. "It's an eyesore. And I'm afraid it's also against community guidelines. We can't have this kind of setup here, Mark. It's excessive." "Excessive?" I repeated, taken aback. "It's a barbecue. People have been having barbecues here for years." "Well, not like this," Karen quipped, her gaze sweeping across the setup like she was inspecting a crime scene. "You should have gotten approval from the HOA first." I looked at her, incredulous. "Are you serious? I've been living here for years, and now suddenly my backyard is a problem." "Yes, Mark, and I'm afraid I'll have to issue a warning. If you go ahead with this event without following proper procedures, you might face a fine." Her voice took on that patronizing tone that made every word feel like a personal attack. I stared at her, speechless for a moment. This wasn't just a barbecue. This was supposed to be a way for the neighborhood to come together. But Karen was turning it into a battleground. "Karen, you really think I'm going to let you ruin this?" I asked, trying to stay calm, though I could feel the anger bubbling up. "Oh, I'm not trying to ruin anything," she said, her smile widening. "I'm just trying to keep things in line with the community rules." She wasn't just talking about rules anymore. This was personal. Karen had been on my case for months about small, insignificant things, from the way my lawn was trimmed to the placement of a few chairs on my deck. But this time, she had gone too far. I didn't want to back down. Not today. As she walked away, I could feel the frustration building inside me. This wasn't just about a barbecue. This was about Karen trying to control everything, and I wasn't going to let that happen. That night, as I stared at the empty, yet beautifully set up backyard, something inside me clicked. I wasn't just going to let Karen win. I was going to turn this into something she couldn't ignore. Something bigger. The next morning, I woke up with a new mission. If Karen was going to try to shut down my barbecue, then I was going to give her something she couldn't possibly compete with. I was going to build a full outdoor kitchen, something epic. A place where not just a few people could enjoy a meal, but the whole neighborhood could come together. And I wasn't just going to host a barbecue. I was going to host a feast. A free feast. For everyone. The next few days were a blur of activity. What started as a simple backyard barbecue transformed into a full-scale operation. I had a vision now, not just to throw a party, but to make a statement. I had already made up my mind. If Karen wanted to make a problem out of my backyard, I was going to turn it into the ultimate outdoor kitchen that would blow her mind and leave the entire block in awe. I wanted to create a space where every neighbor, whether they knew each other or not, could come together and experience something special, something that would shift the community dynamics forever. I got to work immediately. I started by sketching out a design that would make Karen regret ever opening her mouth. I wanted more than just a grill. I needed an entire outdoor kitchen, complete with an island bar, stone countertops, a wood-fired pizza oven, and, of course, an expansive seating area. I sourced materials quickly, choosing rustic stone for the structure, stainless steel for durability, and large slate tiles to create an elegant feel. I spent hours researching the best outdoor kitchen designs, browsing through magazines and online boards for inspiration. I wasn't just building an outdoor kitchen. I was creating a showpiece that would make every neighbor want to gather in my backyard. The real challenge came when it was time to assemble it all. I had no formal experience in construction, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. Armed with tools I barely knew how to use and a relentless drive to prove a point, I set out to build the foundation of my outdoor kitchen. By the time the weekend rolled around, the bones of the kitchen were taking shape. The stone grill, the sleek counters, and the pizza oven were starting to look exactly as I imagined. I felt a surge of pride with every stone I laid, each one representing my defiance against Karen's petty control. It wasn't just about the kitchen. As I worked, the idea of the feast kept growing in my mind. This wouldn't be a typical gathering. This would be something that would turn heads. I wanted to host an event that would make Karen and anyone else who ever doubted me realize the power of community. The word spread quickly. By the time the kitchen was nearing completion, neighbors who I'd barely spoken to were messaging me, asking when the event was happening, eager to join in. The atmosphere shifted. What began as an act of rebellion soon became a movement. People were excited not just to eat, but to be part of something bigger than themselves. But Karen wasn't one to back down either. She had heard about my plans, and she was furious. I could almost hear her seething from across the street as I saw her walking by, taking pictures of the progress, no doubt documenting every violation in her mind. But I didn't care anymore. She could complain all she wanted. I was no longer doing this for her approval. I was doing it for myself and for everyone who had been quietly frustrated by her overbearing rule. This wasn't just a barbecue anymore. It was a challenge to the control she had tried to impose on this community. And I wasn't going to lose. As I set the final touches on the kitchen, I reached out to a few local chefs and food vendors to make sure the feast would be something extraordinary. It wasn't going to be just hot dogs and burgers. I wanted gourmet food that would show the neighborhood what true hospitality looked like. From smoked brisket to wood-fired pizzas and handmade sides, this would be a feast like no other. I also planned to set up an area for kids with games and activities, so everyone, from the oldest to the youngest, would have a reason to join in. The day of the feast arrived, and the transformation of my backyard was complete. The stone countertops gleamed in the sunlight, the pizza oven was smoking with the scent of freshly baked crust, and the tables were laden with an array of food that looked like it came straight from a five-star restaurant. The neighbors began trickling in, some with dishes of their own, others with nothing but a hunger for good food and good company. I could see the smiles on their faces as they approached, some of them even pausing to take in the grandeur of the setup. At first, I thought it might be awkward, especially with Karen lurking somewhere in the background, watching. But as soon as the food started to come off the grill and the pizzas were sliced and served, any tension melted away. People started laughing, sharing stories, and to my surprise, even Karen couldn't resist the smell of sizzling meat wafting through the air. I saw her walking towards the table, her eyes narrowing as she looked over the setup, probably calculating every way she could shut it down. But as she stood there, with no complaints, no arguments, she realized she was powerless. The feast wasn't just about food. It was about unity, and Karen could do nothing to stop it. The block began to feel different, in a way I couldn't quite describe. The usual tension of Karen's watchful eye seemed to dissipate as people gathered around the long tables, eating, talking, and laughing together. It was a stark contrast to the feeling that had hovered over the neighborhood for so long. The feeling of fear, control, and constant judgment. In that moment, I realized what I had done was more than just hosting a barbecue. I had sparked something deeper, something lasting. As the evening wore on, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for everyone in the neighborhood who had been too afraid to speak up, too afraid to challenge the rules that had been imposed upon them. I had built something that Karen could never take away. And as the last plate was cleared and the night came to an end, I knew I had done more than just stand up for myself. I had brought the community together in a way that would be remembered long after the feast ended. As the last of the plates were cleared and the laughter from the evening began to fade, a strange sense of satisfaction washed over me. I had done it. Despite Karen's constant attempts to tear down everything I stood for, I had created something beautiful, something that brought the neighborhood together. But, as with all things in life, the victory wasn't as simple as it seemed. The next few days would prove to be just as intense as the build-up to the feast. The first sign of trouble came the morning after the event when Karen knocked on my door. Her face was pale, a mix of disbelief and frustration etched across her features. I hadn't expected her to come directly to me. But then again, when someone's ego is as big as hers, it's hard for them to let a perceived defeat go unnoticed. As I opened the door, she wasted no time, her words coming out in a sharp, controlled tone, though I could tell she was fuming inside. She accused me of violating every rule in the book, of disrupting the peace, and, of course, of not getting prior approval from the HOA. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. Gone was the usual confidence she exuded when she wielded her position like a weapon. Today, there was only frustration and a little bit of fear. The feast, after all, had been an undeniable success. Neighbors who were once distant or silent now knew what true community looked like, and they weren't going to let Karen stand in the way of that. In fact, I could tell that as she spoke, more and more neighbors were beginning to side with me. That was when I realized that the victory hadn't just been in the feast itself. The real triumph had been in the transformation of the community. As the days went on, the atmosphere in the neighborhood started to shift. Karen's power, the power she had used for years to manipulate the HOA and control everything from fence height to lawn decoration, began to erode. Neighbors who once cowered in her presence were now speaking up, voicing their frustrations about the way she had ruled over them. People started to come to me, asking for help, asking for guidance on how to fight back against her authoritarianism. And so, without even realizing it, I had become a leader. What happened next, however, was even more astonishing. A group of neighbors, all of whom had been affected by Karen's overreach in one way or another, came together to form a new kind of community group. They called it the Neighborhood Freedom Coalition, and its goal was simple: to ensure that every resident had the right to live freely and fairly in their own home, without fear of oppressive rules or unjust fines. At the forefront of this movement were the neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up. Now, they were standing beside me, advocating for change and demanding that the HOA be held accountable for its actions. Karen, of course, was livid. She tried everything to maintain her grip on power, organizing more HOA meetings, sending out more violation notices, even trying to use her influence to turn neighbors against each other. But it was too late. The tide had turned, and people weren't buying into her narrative anymore. The sense of unity and empowerment was palpable, and the more Karen tried to fight it, the more it became clear that she was losing control. Then came the bombshell that finally sealed Karen's fate. It all started when one of the neighbors, an accountant who had been quietly investigating the HOA's finances, uncovered some disturbing information. Karen had been using the HOA funds for her personal gain, funding her own renovations, and, even worse, funneling money into private businesses that benefited her personally. This discovery sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Karen's carefully constructed facade of being the community protector came crumbling down. The HOA board, once so blindly loyal to her, began to distance themselves. Some of them resigned outright, and others were quietly pushed out. The whole board was in disarray, and the power dynamics had completely shifted. At that moment, I realized just how far we had come. What started as a simple barbecue had ignited a movement that reached far beyond my backyard. It had sparked a rebellion against an unfair system, and Karen's grip on the neighborhood was slipping away fast. But the true victory came not from watching Karen crumble, but from the fact that we had all come together. People who once felt powerless were now united in the pursuit of a fair and just community. The changes were immediate. The new HOA board, made up of more reasonable and community-minded individuals, worked to revise the rules that had been so unfairly enforced. They introduced new policies that focused on fostering inclusivity and cooperation instead of control and division. The old HOA bylaws were overhauled, and a new set of rules was put in place, designed to respect the needs and rights of all residents. But perhaps the most powerful change of all was the way the community had transformed. We were no longer just neighbors. We were a family, bound together by the shared experience of fighting for what was right. Karen's house, which had once been a symbol of her control, was now on the market. She moved out quietly, her influence fading into the past. The last time I saw her, she was loading up her car, her face a picture of resentment and defeat. She had no idea how much she had underestimated us, and I felt a strange sense of closure knowing that the last remnants of her power were slipping away. As for me, the neighborhood had changed, and so had I. What began as a simple act of defiance had turned into something much bigger than I could have imagined. I had found my voice, and more importantly, I had helped my neighbors find theirs. We had learned that standing together, supporting each other, and fighting for what was right could bring about real change. The feast wasn't just a meal, it was a symbol of the new community we had built. And as I watched families sitting together, children playing freely in the yard, and friends laughing and enjoying the food, I knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter for our neighborhood, one where everyone had a voice. And no one was afraid to stand up for what they believed in.